Good morning, and thank you for joining the Cratus webinar. I'm Nick Kilby and I'm the CEO of Cratus. Our first webinar was called Moving London Out of Lockdown, and that now seems an age ago. As children return across London to their schools, for many of the first time since March, we return to focus on London, having dodged the quarantine, nearly in one case of our guests, and renewed vigour and enthusiasm for getting London going again. The important issues of the day will be discussed and challenges identified. But let me tell you a bit about Cratus if you've not met us before. We're a specialist local government consultancy providing planning, communications, advisory support for local authorities, supporting the creation of new sustainable communities and providing effective public affairs and public relations campaign. Our team works nationwide, supported by offices in Southampton, Bristol, London and Manchester. We invite you to submit questions for the Q&A, and at the bottom of the screen you'll see the way to do that, and we really do want those questions to come through. We will finish sharp at 9:30. I will introduce our speakers in reverse order, and then when we've heard from them we'll move into a wider discussion, and then we'll take your questions. So let me get to the speakers with no further delay. Joanna Rowell is from Arup. She has been a leading economic development and regeneration advisor, worked at the GLA and has worked on master plans, strategic plans, advises city governments on a wide range of topics, including infrastructure investment, airport cities, regeneration and economic policy. Don't we need Joanna today? Then we go to Steve Curran, the leader of the London Borough of Hounslow, who hasn't recently retired. We missed that one. He's been retired from the NHS for the last 3 years, because he found working in the NHS and being a hero in Hounslow just a bit too much to handle all at the same time. But Steve has done a remarkable job in Hounslow and will share the new challenges that have been thrown up at him. Geeta Nanda, OBE, is a professional of housing for the last 26 years. She is the CEO of the Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Association and the Vice Chair of the G15. Right in the eye of the storm is Geeta, and she will be sharing the issues and challenges that stop her and her colleagues from fully supporting the London plan, maybe. Then there's Oliver Knight from Knight Frank. He is a research partner on residential housing, and he's going to give us the real hard data of what is happening in London today. But our main guest, and the person we're going to try and help today, he may not always feel that way, is Jules Pipe, CBE, the Deputy Mayor for planning, regeneration and employment. The issues here are massive, and it's a role that is vital in the next few months coming forward. Jules is a veteran. He has been an outstanding mayor of Hackney and was appointed by the mayor when he started just 4.5 years ago. Jules was feeling much younger then. But Jules, please take us through what it's like and what the challenges are for you today.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks for the invite. Nice to be here. Yeah, I mean, you said, take 5 minutes or so just to kind of outline perhaps, my perspective about what's going on at City Hall, what the priorities. I think it's really interesting in a way that the priorities in some ways you could say haven't changed. The mayor's #1 priority has always been the safety and security of Londoners. And pre-COVID, that's in the form of crime and housing people, giving them the security of a roof over their head. And today, it's the safety of Londoners, perhaps more in a health sense, but still the security of a roof over the head, over people's heads, is just as high a priority as it was before COVID. And so that work continues. And I think what COVID has done is bring into stark relief the importance of so many of the policies that we already had in place, particularly onto London, within the London plan, which I'm sure we'll get on to. I mean, obviously we're currently facing the most challenging period in recent history in London. Economic, social, health impact can't be underestimated. And what we need to do is restore confidence in the city, minimise the impact on London's most vulnerable communities, and of course rebuild the city's economy and civil society. So keeping Londoners safe, tackling the housing crisis is got to be number one. But COVID really has thrown into stark relief the city's inequalities. People still sleeping rough, overcrowded homes, temporary accommodation, private renters, all of them are facing no security of tenure. And that has got to, that is one of the biggest housing debates that we're having with the government at the moment about when, they've renewed for another month the emergency measures, but what's the long-term solution? And Tom Copley at City Hall is leading their housing delivery task force, working with many partners who I know are on this call today from across the sector to help deliver a recovery plan that can try and get housing supply back on track. Particularly affordable housing supply, which when the mayor was really delivering prior to COVID, we were meeting the government targets that we'd been set in return for the housing grant, and COVID has obviously brought that to a grinding halt. It's coming back, but it's still slower than it should be. The mayor set up a London Recovery Board, a whole series of missions that it's looking at. The renewal of our high streets, whether it's in localities across the capital or the central activity zone as well, which obviously has been devastated by the lack of footfall as a result of COVID. But again, I mean, that's a policy that actually was pre-existing in a way. The London plan, very big on the sort of polycentric vision for a city, not designing our city, continuing to design it on the basis that outer London would just be a big dormitory that everyone crams onto Crossrails 2, 3, 4, and 5 over the next 100 years to jobs in the centre. Got to move away from that model. COVID has just accelerated that the imperative of that, and made us talk more about what was already in the London plan. But there are many more. I mean, that's obviously got an immediate focus about recovery, but also a long-term. There's got to be a long-term vision for how we build our local communities and the facilities for our local communities. But that's just one strand. There are strands on civil society, improving digital access, Green New Deal for young people, good work for Londoners, better health and well-being. All of these things are pre-existing topics. They were all important before. They were all things that we wanted to talk about. But COVID is just bringing them into sharper relief and making it just more urgent that we come up with long-term solutions for these. I've mentioned the CAS. I mean, that's almost £40 billion worth of net GVA to the Exchequer. So the government is rightly worried about getting that back on track. And obviously the government's doing a lot to implore people to go back. But of course there is this mismatch between getting people back into work, so they in the centre, so that they can use put money into that economy, keep the cultural infrastructure alive in London, for example. But if, on the other hand, the health guidelines are making offices only at 20% capacity, if you can observe those guidelines, then there's not a reason for 80% of those people who used to go into the centre to go in anymore. And we've got to address that, rather than on the one hand be implored to go into central London, but on the other hand implored to keep away and because of social distancing. But the mayor's certainly are doing as much as he can within those constraints to encourage the use of things, whether it's some other Londoner campaign, London's Open, Pay It Forward, the Back to Business Fund. All these things could make a contribution, but they're all sort of undermined by this difficulty that we have in actually getting the bulk of people back into their places of work, and we've got to overcome that. Are we going to overcome that before there is a widely available vaccine? I think that's the big question. Battling to get 80% of people back into London still doesn't help if actually the margins are so small on some of these concerns, particularly in the cultural sector, that they fail if they don't get more than 95% of their audience back. And we're not, as a nation, addressing those the reality of that. Instead, we're going round in circles about getting people back on the tube. I think I've probably spoke for enough, but there are a whole swathe of things that we can cover. The importance of skills and retraining. Again, it's something else that was a huge element of my work and very important to the mayor. It's taken on a whole new importance now with Brexit looming, a harder Brexit being apparent, and the need for potential retraining if certain jobs are not going to be coming back as a result of COVID. So again, once again, it's a greater focus and imperative on issues that we already knew that as a society we ought to be tackling. So let me stop there as a sort of as a scene setter. Let the others get a word in, and then we can have a chat.
I think that's a great start there that I know people are going to pick up on. Oliver, tell us about your research. What's going on currently in London, and what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak quite briefly, but before we hear from the rest of the panel, just to give a little bit of context around where housing delivery in London sits today. And with that in mind, I just have some data to kind of share looking at that housing delivery, what's happened in light of recent events, and also some thoughts on where that might leave London moving forward. And I guess the first thing to say is that, unsurprisingly, the second quarter of the year was a pretty subdued one for the new homes market. That impact of lockdown inevitably resulting in a pretty significant drop-off in housing delivery of all tenures, and really putting the brakes on what was a relatively strong start to the year. Just to run through some of those numbers, if we look at the volume of new homes completed between April and June, those fell to its lowest quarterly level since 2013, so some 44% below the level that we saw in Q2 last year. On an annual basis, so taking into account everything that's been built over the last 12 months, delivery was down in London by about 14% and standing at around 36,000 additional homes. So still significantly down on those London housing targets. In terms of future delivery, new starts dropped 33% quarter on quarter. And what we're really seeing there, that's really reflecting this kind of confidence issue that we've been seeing among both private and social house builders against what is and what really remains a pretty uncertain economic backdrop, and also, of course, a backdrop which has some fairly large question marks still hanging over it about where longer-term demand for housing and for urban living in particular is going to end up. Now, kind of given all of this disruption that we've seen over the last few months, this drop-off that we've seen is not really that surprising, and it's one of the reasons why, as well as the kind of numbers looking at kind of housing delivery, I thought it was also probably worth drawing attention to some additional data points, which probably aren't quite as headline-grabbing, but they are going to be central in terms of determining how the development market and the housing market in London emerges from the current situation. So really importantly, for example, the planning system has been able to adjust pretty quickly in London. So full planning consents across London actually reached around 80% of pre-lockdown levels in June. And new applications for housing were at their highest level in more than 8 months, which is really going to build on what is already a fairly healthy pipeline of consented schemes across the capital. There also remains a significant pipeline of over 61,000 private units currently under construction on schemes of at least 20 homes. And if we take both of those points together, now then those factors are really going to help support this kind of return to full construction output over the medium term. But it is very much a medium-term view. We're not expecting house building to get back up to the levels that we were at last year, for example, for at least another 2 years as kind of house builders kind of grapple with everything that's going on, and not to mention obviously Brexit on the horizon as well. The pipeline for affordable housing was also looking pretty strong pre-pandemic. Starts on GLA housing programs reached a record high of just over 17,000 in 2019, 2020. Although again, it is worth noting that the recent updates from some of the large housing associations point to a fairly significant COVID-related drop in new starts since April. And that's obviously, and I'm sure Geeta can build on this, is going to be something which is going to impact the ability of housing associations to deliver the affordable housing that London so desperately needs. One thing that we did see in Q2, which I think was quite interesting from an affordable housing perspective, is a significant increase in the number of units which switched tenures, so switching from private to affordable tenure. That accounted for about 23% of all new home sales, which is up from about 10% previously. It'll be interesting to keep monitoring this, seeing how it develops, because ultimately, if sales rates for new homes start to slow, or there is a kind of a lack of credit availability in the mortgage market, which we are starting to potentially see, we may well see a further increase in this switch to affordable tenures. Another point to make, which relates to this kind of diversity of tenure point, is actually the opportunity that we see post-COVID for additional tenures to help support that recovery. Build to rent, in particular in London. That build to rent market currently accounts for around 29% of all private homes currently under construction. And when you take into account bulk sales from developers, it accounts for about a third of all new home sales in London as well. And we can see both of those proportions potentially increasing. And any kind of support for this market is going to ensure that additional housing is able to be brought forward at a much faster pace. And then just finally, from me, just a quick word on the land market. It's fair to say that continues to be quiet, though we are starting to see activity there pick up. There's been a real shift in focus among land buyers towards smaller sites of up to 150 units, which I think reflects about kind of three things. Partly it's the absence of the big PLC house builders in the land market at the moment. Partly it's a reduced appetite for risk, but also, and quite importantly, I think going forward, it also reflects the fact that such sites generally come without the big associated infrastructure costs. And that's something which we potentially would need to look out for as we look to build our way out of the kind of current situation. So overall, before I hand back over to Nick, I think it's probably fair to say it's a fairly mixed picture for the housing and development market at the moment. A lot of short-term challenges, and delivery is undoubtedly likely to slow as a result, which is going to put pressure on those housing targets in the London plan. But the longer-term picture potentially looking slightly brighter. Thank you. I'll hand back over to Nick.
Thank you, Oliver. Geeta, the current on the ground for you at the Metropolitan Thames Valley and for your fellow members of the G15, you've been through an interesting time working with your current and existing residents. What's the reality for you in this world that Oliver's just painted?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that our ambitions are there. Our ambitions to keep supplying affordable housing in London are absolutely true, and that's our aim. But there are a couple of really big stumbling blocks, and I can't underestimate them really. The first one is that we've had this cross-subsidy model that's existed for some time. It's been under pressure for a while, and grant rates of around £70,000 per home when you need £200 to £300 subsidy for a social housing home means that it's really we're stretched. We can't carry on providing those affordable homes, those social rented homes that are so needed, without an increase in subsidy, and it's fallen by sort of 50% over the last decade in terms of that subsidy. At the moment, the market is pretty buoyant, but we all expect that won't carry on. I think we're all not of the view that the current sort of improvements is going to be there. So the risk around sort of market products and market sale is something that we're thinking about very carefully in terms of the programme going forward. and some ability to be able to have some kind of buyer that can be guaranteed if we are to continue doing some kind of market sale. And I know the task force have been talking about that. But the second issue is really around safety, and you talked about it, Jules, very clearly around, you know, the safety of Londoners, and for us, it's all around the building safety and the fire safety that we are having to look at. And I mean, the issue is enormous. Our residents are really suffering. You know, our leaseholders are really, really suffering. We have people ringing us up who are suicidal because they don't know how they're going to deal with this issue and how they're going to deal with the problem. And we're left with very few tools in our toolbox, even though we are there holding, you know, we are the landlord and we are responsible for the safety of our residents. There is a huge problem with the external wall system forms that are required by mortgage lenders, and mortgage lenders requiring this on all sorts of buildings. Every time we open up a building, there are issues, not just say cladding issues, but you know, issues around the work that's been carried out and the remediation that's required. There's only 290 odd assessors in the country trying to deal with all landlords who are trying to deal with this issue. And we've had, you know, building deregulation that's been going on over many, many years. The consequence is a bill, you know, bills that we are facing. A consequence of that is what we can put into new affordable homes in terms of development. And, you know, the answer has to be something which is bigger than each individual landlord grappling with the issues that they have around their remediation of their blocks. And for those leaseholders who are caught and stuck at a time when lots of people are trying to sell because there isn't the information or a timeline really in terms of when things can be completed. And I think, you know, it takes up a lot of our time, if I'm honest, a lot of our discussion, a lot of our time around how we're going to solve this issue and how we're going to keep building homes for future, you know, Londoners. And we mustn't forget, you know, G15 houses 1 in 10 Londoners, and we are housing the people who are, you know, been delivering shopping. We are housing the people who are running the tubes. We are housing the nurses that are in the hospitals. You know, we are housing the people that are keeping the economy going. And unless we keep building new homes, what is going to happen to our economy more broadly? And so, you know, ambition is there, but it's thwarted at the moment by, you know, subsidy levels and by sort of building safety and fire safety. And, you know, how do we grapple with all of that and keep building the homes that Londoners need? So I suppose, you know, that's our big issues right now.
Right. Well, thank you, Keita, for sharing those with us. Steve Curran, we cut to you. You've been one of the big providers of new homes in London. You've been building away in West London. What are the new challenges that COVID's brought to you, and how do you respond to some of the things you've heard today?
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here on the call. Challenges of COVID. So Jules and Greta have picked up some of the issues that we're all facing. It's demanded outstripping supply as always. It's certainly in social housing. We've got an ambitious target over this period, over this administration, of building 1,000 council homes, and we're on target to do that, although it's slightly delayed. And with a further target of 5,000 new homes in the borough. We estimate that our own delivery program has been put back by about 12 weeks because of COVID, but we're moving at pace on that at the moment. And we think there's for our delivery plan is probably an extra cost of around £11 million. So there are costs as well as time delays that are affecting the delivery. Things we haven't talked about today, and I know Jules is very involved in, is around jobs and training and apprenticeships. We're greatly affected by COVID and the effects on the airline industry. In West London, I don't think people have really understood yet the effect of the decrease in the airline industry will have in West London, and then on London as a whole, and then the country. So we've got two constituencies in our borough. We've got Felton Heston and Brentford and Isleworth. In Felton Heston, we've got the highest level of COVID residents of any other borough in London. So it's when COVID ends, and if there isn't a solution found to people like me, I'm on my last day of quarantine because I went to Spain. Unless the solution is that we can get people, encourage people to start flying again, go on holiday, and business people to fly again, there's going to be a real problem around high unemployment. So we've seen a massive increase in people on universal credit. We think growth will be up to 15% down over the next 12 months. So huge effect. But we've set up our own recovery board now, economic recovery board. In fact, I'm chairing a meeting this afternoon. And what we're doing, we're taking this head on, and we have to stimulate the economy. That's either through funding from the government and support through the mayor, or we've got to do it ourselves. So we're doing that, and we've got people on the board from our big developers in the borough, other public sector and private sector people. So to ensure we're going in the right direction. But it's about, everything's about confidence. So we've got two big developments going on at the moment, the Ballymore site in Brentford, and that carried on not at the pace we'd like because of COVID, but it's still been going on. It's picked up now, and we've got Barrack development. So we're going to have a new 27-storey tower in the middle of Hounslow with about 500 units plus, and the retail to go with it. So we're pushing ahead. When I became leader in 2014, I kept the planning and regen portfolio, and I think that political will to carry on and to keep delivering is really important, and that gives confidence, I think, to developers. They'll get the support they need to make a reasonable profit, but also deliver new homes. There's a real push for us now around sustainability and carbon neutral homes as far as possible, so we're working very hard on that. And we've got our own small sites program, which is supported by the mayor, and one of those sites we're going to put 5 carbon neutral homes on, just as a pilot to see what it costs, what are the extra times, etc., etc. So we're pushing ahead, and in August we went out to consult with residents on an estate regeneration in Brentford. So we've got 2 we're consulting on at the moment. So I think it's about the will to succeed, not to be diverted because of COVID too much. Like Jules said, you know, the mayor's responsibility is the safety of London and its residents. Mine's the same. We only had, not the right way to put it. We unfortunately lost 250 residents roughly to COVID, so not affected as some London boroughs, but it has an effect on confidence, I think. We've had a couple of spikes recently. So I think it's really important that councils deliver what they said they were going to deliver. I think the interesting conversation between the mayor and Generic on the London plan is a diversion, and we should keep concentrating on delivering, and as Oliver and Greta said, affordable homes, which are truly affordable for people in London. But I'm really worried about the loss of jobs, especially for young people, or the opportunity for people with young jobs in London, particularly in Hounslow, over the next year, and the drip effect that will have on confidence, the effect it have on people who are going to join the housing ladder, who may think twice, and about suppliers. So I think we just got to keep pushing ahead and do what we said we were going to do, despite COVID and all the other problems. And I accept what Gita said about fire safety. It's been a huge problem for whether it's RSLs or councils to deal with that. We were fortunate we only had one small block that we had ACM on, and we dealt with that pretty quickly within about 18 months. But you know, there were real problems around that, and it's not going away. So I'll stop there.
Steve, I actually just have one question. There's something that you said to me about COVID is becoming an excuse for people on planning applications. There is an element of people using it.
I think that there's always a bit of NIMBYism in the system. We know that. You know, if you're a long-standing councillor, as Jules was, and Rita, when she's putting her applications in, you know, there is a lot of NIMBYism. We're seeing more of that now. because people, and as Jules mentioned it, you know, this dichotomy with the government, one saying we want everyone to go back to central London, yet councils like ours are saying stay local. We just launched our campaign, the Hounslow Pound, spend it in Hounslow. We don't want, because our high streets are dying. There's been 3 major reports since 2010, so you know who was in power then, to deal with the high street. None of them have been implemented, and there's been no fundamental change to the high streets because they won't sort out business rates and rents. And that's the problem, fundamental problem. And still that's sorted out, it won't change. So we're encouraging our residents not to go into town because our high streets are dying and we want people to shop locally. And I don't think we'll ever go back to the numbers of people going into town as we did pre-COVID. It will never happen. We had, just to finish off, Nick, because
yes,
you started me off.
No, now I've got you going, you keep going.
Within 2 weeks, we just moved to our new offices just over a year ago, 6 floors. In January, I was moaning we should have put more floors on, we could have rented them out. And then within a couple of weeks, literally, we're saying we've emptied our building and we had 1,500 staff working from home within 2 weeks because we didn't have enough space for them when we designed and built the building. So we expect people to be working from home for quite a significant part of their working week. So we've accelerated that. And what COVID has done is accelerated people's the real understanding about work-life balance and what that really means. And that's a problem for the government and us. Yeah,
Steve, it is. And I think it is actually quite interesting because there is a big change in footfall in central London. Everyone can see it instantly as you arrive into the centre. But at the same time, it's an opportunity for all the town centres on the outside to keep their residents spending money. And that's going to be an interesting tug of war because neither are wrong. Both need the support of us. Joanna, the floor is yours to sort of have a look at and take us through it. But it's really interesting because it's really clear. Everything that the mayor has already been pushing is still vital. It's still the same policies need to be delivered. Skills and jobs are much bigger priority, as Steve has been saying than perhaps before. But is it really keep going the same as before?
There was so much in everything that everybody said. I think I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 points that I feel are probably the important ones for me to highlight at this point in the conversation. So, Steve, you just said that there is a sort of a will to succeed, and I think one of the things that we're seeing, certainly from the sector and the industry I work in, is that's absolutely true between public and private sector. So I think the one thing that we're witnessing in the work that I'm doing, looking at recovery and indeed housing and employment and jobs, is that we really need to use this moment, for want of a better word, to strengthen the partnerships between the public and private sector, because we're all in it together, if you like. But I think one of the things that's been really highlighted through this situation, and actually if I reflect slightly on one of the questions that's already come in about change of work patterns, the way in which we're moving around cities and indeed delivering housing and jobs, is actually, I think, social equity, and actually understanding in a really granular fashion the way that our sectors function in London, and the way that we need to make sure that housing and employment delivery are aligned, so that we don't see a mismatch between those who are in a place of privilege actually being able to work from home and being able to, you know, choose whether we go into the city or not, is quite different to some of the industries and sectors and workers that Geeta was just reflecting on around the core parts of our city that we really need to support to keep functioning: nurses, midwives, you know, people delivering our food and so forth. So I think this is going to be incredibly complex, and Jules, you know, in his opening said that we can't forget everything that's already been set out for London. So therefore the polycentric nature of the city probably does need to be reflected on, and we need to make sure that high streets can thrive, town centres can thrive. I think that one of the areas that we're really interested in at the moment is digital technology and access to digital technology, and the way in which we can use the digital tools to upskill, reskill, help with sectoral growth, and indeed planning applications and housing delivery, and all those different areas that everyone's reflected on. I think another thing I was really interested in as that conversation was happening was thinking about looking out as much as looking in. So I work with global cities, as Nick mentioned at the beginning, and a lot of them are contacting us and saying what you're doing in London and how you're getting through this. Sydney, for instance, is really looking at suburban growth and the way in which it wants to see its residents moving around the city, and it wants to examine whether it's got the right, you know, planning conditions and infrastructure plans and so forth. It's interesting, everyone is still looking to how London is getting out of this. New York, you know, I've got people from across global offices in Europe kind of asking what London are up to. So I think actually looking out as well as looking in has been really interesting for me to think about the way that the pandemic and the outcomes can be managed. I do think we need to still invest in infrastructure. And I do think that housing delivery obviously has been stalled through this time, but I want to kind of reflect back to that will to succeed. None of the developers and investors that we're working with want to slow down, and that's the point that Oliver was making about access to credit and ensuring confidence in the market continues, which kind of leads me back to the point around equity and access to housing. So I feel like I've slightly rambled there, but I think the thing that I'm really interested in maybe thinking about in the questions is how we can look at the long-term plan that the London plan sets out. And I think the London plan is excellent because it is it's the place that actually is able to talk about all the different facets that are needed to keep London moving. And I think sometimes we decouple housing and employment too much. And I think the London plan does a really good job of trying to knit together a really complex set of systems that we need when we talk about housing. And I'm heartened actually that other places I work in are starting to look at housing, infrastructure and community and jobs together, because I think for too long we've decoupled the argument, and for too long we've said we need some infrastructure and we need some employment and we need some housing. But actually I think employment delivers housing, but it needs to be the right type of employment, and it needs to be the way in which we look at skills and opportunities. But I think I'm most concerned at the moment in the work I'm doing about equity, and not always having the debate about we can all work from home. We can't all work from home because there are people in other types of employment who really need our support and help, and we need to think about them as well.
It's a really good point actually that Joe Incutti from Kia has sent through to us about the guidance and the parameters, and people are adapting, trying to change to the need. And we did a survey of our staff. We employed 28 people, and only a third wanted to work in the office. And some people we've supplied office equipment so that they can work properly, looking at all these changes. But one of the issues is about accommodation that can actually allow you to work from home. And that's an issue that I'm very aware of. There's also a question to come through about the new standard methodology and how that helps, if it helps at all, and what government is doing around us at this moment in time on a national level. And Jules, hopefully a very positive response, very supportive of all that you're doing. How did you feel about some of the points that were raised, and where we're going with this conversation?
I'm struggling, I think, to think of something I disagreed with actually in that. So I hope we're not in danger of bringing this to a halt too quickly, because we all agree. I mean, if I go to one of the questions, I think, or points that was made about, it's not just the sort of the 80% issue, it's the, you know, and only having capacity for 20% under guidelines. But, you know, and we touched on it then, sort of the difference in attitude about working from home and the office. I think we've got to be careful in not overplaying that. I think at the moment it's been a novelty. I think you know, we've been through a lot in this country over the last few years, and people have been a bit weary, and I think the change has been as good as a rest in some ways, in terms of, you know, the difference in working from home. It was an odd summer period as well, you know, kids away from school. I think, you know, obviously it's all thrown up in the air, but I think once things settle, I think people will begin to recognize again the value in collegiate working. I think this mantra, oh, people are just as productive at home as they are in the office. I think there's a debate to be had about that. Yes, it's certainly more efficient regards about commuting and not having that commute, undoubtedly. But I think as the discussion goes on over the next year, I think people will be more talking about what one loses in not actually having those collective meetings, the water cooler moments. Look at the huge growth in the WeWork phenomenon before COVID. They all had an option to work at home as well. They all had kitchen tables or their bedrooms or whatever to work in, but they chose not to. There was seen as a real value in being amongst other people to share ideas, bounce ideas off each other, identify opportunities. And I think it's that kind of soft stuff like that which is going to bring us back perhaps to a slightly more normal mindset. Not completely back, though. I totally get that. There will be people for whom actually flexible working, avoiding the commute, is enough to change want to change permanently. And I absolutely see that even that small amount of change relative to how it is now could be enough to create an existential threat. We've seen it on, say, the move to online shopping, existential threat to redevelopments of, say, Brent Cross, the Whitgift Centre, and the importance that they are for those localities. And as I say, where I started from, even if just 10% of people decide not to go back, and even if it's that low in the long term, that could be enough to see a number of businesses in central London not survive. It hits their margins enough, and I think cultural industries is something that could face a real existential threat, and that in turn damages London as a whole. The global reputation we have. The reason why businesses want to locate in London, the nightlife, the culture, and the restaurants, and the bars, the coffee shops, all that kind of ecosystem puts London as a global world city. If much of that offer can't survive on the new footfall, London needs to reinvent itself for the long term to maintain its position as a place where the tourists come and businesses want to locate.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's the interesting part of the economics of London. Is it's not just the people who live in London, there's the tourists, there's the business visitors. It is a world hub, and at the moment it's being starved of some really big chunks of support, and which is exposing the weakness in our hospitality. And
but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I think we shouldn't get too hung up on some seismic shift in numbers, because I think much of the numbers will come back. I think the devil is in the detail about what the margins are, and even if it's only a small amount short, that could be enough to create these kind of threats. And I think that's what we need to understand. What are the small margins which we may never, as I say, if you need 95% to survive, well, there's no good arguing about, are we only going to get 20% back or 50% back? Actually, it could be we need 95% back. And if we're only going to get 94, we have an existential threat, and we should be trying to look at those kind of margins and that kind of detail.
I totally agree, actually. And Steve, that's really some of the things that you're facing in Hounslow, isn't it? The change in the behaviour of the aviation industry in the short term, and what are you going to do in the medium term while there is Oliver said about 2 years before the house building industry gets back to its numbers. I've seen some hairy and scary figures about the aviation industry getting up to its turnover at Heathrow again. So that's a big issue for you on the skills and jobs, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm on Jules's skills board for the mayor, and we've moved to the focus. I know Jules is very pushing that very hard on jobs. It's about jobs now, not just about skills. So we've got something like 18,000 SMEs in Hounslow. Many of them support the aviation industry. So the effect is catastrophic if the decline continues longer than what we predicted what's being predicted anyway. So a real threat, and Jules is right around the margins. We're on very small margins for businesses surviving, and it makes it extremely difficult. But I was interested what Greta and Joanna said about thinking about those workers who can't work from home. That's really important for us. In Hounslow, we didn't stop any of our waste and recycling services at all. We carried on all the way through, and we saw some really nice gestures from residents to our staff. From even I don't drink whiskey, so I managed to get rid of a bottle of whiskey to our waste and recycling crew. So if anyone's going to send me whiskey, I don't like it. Anyway, so I think there's a real appreciation now of those workers that support our communities and our infrastructure. And Joanna's point about linking development to jobs and infrastructure is really important, because we know there's a real lag behind a housing consent being given, the houses being built, and then the infrastructure following up anything between 5 and 10 years later. So we need to choreograph that much better so that the development comes with infrastructure simultaneously. I know that's a utopia world we would be living if that happened, but I think we've got to strive much more for infrastructure, which then creates the jobs, which then allow the local people to buy or rent new property. So those are some of the things we can do. And I'm not convinced the new changes to the planning system are going to work. I think we have to be really careful. We're not going to chuck the baby out with the bathwater. We don't have a problem around planning consents and development in Hounslow. Most boroughs don't. So I don't know, it's a bit like fiddling while Rome burns, isn't it, at the moment? They don't know what to do next.
Yeah, we got, 300,000 consents not built out, 1 million consents across the country not built out. I mean, there are things that can be improved about the planning system, undoubtedly. The first thing is resources and being able to resource it properly. I've never met a developer who wouldn't say, I'd happily pay more money if I got the service that I wanted and the speed of the service that I wanted. And that's not borough's fault, because it's a prescribed regime from central government. I think, there's an issue on flexibility. It's mad if some jobs worth gets fussed about, a bicycle shop serving coffee because, oh no, that's not A1 use. And I think we've grown up beyond that now, as new kind of models of retail and service have come about. But the use class system, and what's been changed with that is going to be difficult, I think, especially at a time when we really need to put into action those reports that Steve was talking about the high street, and the adaptive strategies work that the GLA is undertaking and will underpin the work we want to do on high street recovery. We really need to curate the offer on the high street, and have boroughs have the wherewithal to be able to curate the right offer for local people to make these vibrant places. The whole kind of E-class, E-use class, and the wiping away of all the other things is going to make that more of a challenge, along with the PD rights and expansion of PD rights. I don't think that's been the right way forward. And then on the kind of broader aspects of the white paper, okay, I can see that they wanted to simplify the process, but the zoning guidance for New York runs to 1,500 pages. It's only understood by planners, and on top of the 1,500 pages, people write endless guidance books about how to interpret it. So I think moving to a more zoning system, it may have been held up as a give certainty up front, but it's going to be a long and rocky road on the path there. And when boroughs have to make all their zoning decisions plot by plot, everyone's going to have to think of what they don't want to see there. They've got three years to decide everything they don't ever want to see on that side. And I think what's going to end up happening is probably the zoning rules per plot are going to be drawn quite tightly, understandably, and therefore developers are going to want to go beyond what's zoned so often, it will result in them still putting in planning permissions. Because it won't. So I think as a route to kind of obviate the need for planning so much, I'm not sure it's going to achieve what it sets out. Meanwhile, we would have spent, well, they will have spent 18 months trying to get it through Parliament, and a bunch of aggrieved backbenchers who have been lobbied by their soon-to-be abolished district councillors. Only then to spend 3 years trying arguments about zoning different plots, which people will still then put in planning permissions. So, but when you wait the outcome of the London plan, I think we are going to get there. I think that their concentration on the PD rights, use classes white paper has put it on the back burner. But I mean, but there was a question there about policy and relying on it. I mean, they've given every indication that they will agree it. All the changes, the 17 or so changes that they reckon that they want, that the Secretary of State wants to see, didn't really impact on housing at all. So, you know, all the affordable housing policies were there. I mean, there was the bit about small sites and the reliance on small sites, although the policy isn't so much removed. It's more about how much yield we can rely from that policy on overall housing numbers. But the actual policy, housing policies within it weren't really touched by the Secretary of State. So I think it does already give that certainty there. There's a question mark over it, industrial. But I'd like to think everyone's sensible enough to have seen, especially within under COVID, the reliance we've had on last mile delivery, B8, is all still really, really important.
In fact, well, actually, all of you are being fantastic about picking up the questions, because I think we've dealt with Glenn McFarlane's interested in the high street. He's going to join a task force at the moment, and I think that the curating comment, I think, is absolutely right. I think there's a way in which people have to be a little bit more proactive in getting people into the high street, and obviously a change in the taxation, as Steve has gone on about, is something that I think all of us would push for the retail sector. Chris Tinker's leading us to talk about nearly all the big PLCs are moving out of London. Do we have the confidence of the right mix in the development industry to deliver the housing and the affordable in the next 6 years? I think is really the essence, when most of the PLCs are saying it's not for us at the moment. And I know that there are a couple of developments that in the new economics at the moment are underwater, and they can't bring them forward. So they might have planning, but they just can't bring them forward. Is that going to be a problem that we're going to see more of? And that may be Jules and Oliver.
It's been a growing problem. The reliance, the increasing reliance over the last decade on developments having to fund all the infrastructure on a site. And I say that as someone who wants to see absolutely the maximum amount of affordable housing out of a development, and whatever planning obligations that are required to make a development work properly, whether it's a new doctor's surgery or something, or a contribution to expanding the local primary school. I'm all for a development paying its proper dues. But I do sympathise absolutely with an industry which is told, well, see that road, see that new railway station that doesn't even exist yet, and that secondary school, which is what, 15 plus, could be 15, 20 million, if you're lucky. And I've known some cost as much as 40 million on difficult sites. If a developer is told, well, it's all down to you, because there's no central subsidy for the government are out of the subsidy game for infrastructure and heavy infrastructure like new tube lines, then it is going to stall, and developers are going to say, well, this is a mug's game in London. We may as well go and look where things are easier. And a lot of cities, big cities up and down the country, are they are amazed at the amount that London expects. You know, when I've talked to city leaders and about what London expects out of Section 106, there is nothing like that up in you know, outside of London to the extent it has to take place in London. But you know, without the infrastructure, London's going to grind to, you know, pre-COVID, this is just has always been the case. London's going to grind to a halt if we don't invest in infrastructure and keep it up to scratch. And we can't open up. You know, you take up the Old Kent Road. There's loads of development potential down along the Old Kent Road. Many people have got sites that are just raring to go, but without the Bakerloo line extension, for example, it's going to grind to a halt. You can't fit the number of people that are going to end up along the Old Kent Road on the buses. It needs the Bakerloo line extension, but those developments alone are not going to pay for it.
No, I agree. And Oliver, from your perspective and your clients?
I think it's really interesting, Jules, that you mentioned the Old Kent Road and the Bakerloo line extension, because I was going to touch on that, because I mean, we have clients who own sites on the Old Kent Road, and they're paying, you know, SIL and everything else for this this kind of gamble, as it were, of will the infrastructure be delivered. And you know, there are plenty of opportunities there for new housing, but for a lot of those major PLCs, it's a big risk, and for some of them, it's something which they're not willing to take, especially when you factor in the fact that the cost of land in London is you know, exponentially high compared to markets just outside, and you know, it's one of the reasons that you know, as the kind of question kind of alludes to, that a lot of the PLCs are you know, stopping their land spend in central London, and until we have that kind of certainty, or more certainty, on the delivery of new infrastructure, which, as you say, you know, London so desperately needs, particularly with the you know, population forecasts and the like, it's going to be very difficult for some of those big house builders who are responsible for a lot of the development which takes place in London to actually take that gamble. So I mean, it's definitely something which we're seeing and is affecting the kind of ability of those house builders to deliver, or the appetite even for them to deliver homes in parts of the capital where, you know, potentially there is a lot of opportunity for growth, and also the land available to deliver large sites.
Yeah. I mean, I can sympathise with the government, you know, and agree with the government's desire to, you know, get more small and medium-sized builders back into the game, but they're not going to develop out those big sites. We still need the big players to do the big sites. And
there's definitely an issue there. Gita, the subsidy issue for you to the G15 to step into the shoes is a really big issue for the conversation to really go forward. And also, and we won't deal with it today, but the issue of safety is a real brake on your ability to step into the shoes of some of those PLCs, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the changes around Section 106 and affordable housing that is sort of proposed is, you know, also on those larger schemes, the way you keep things going is by having a multitude of different tenures, don't you, on large schemes? So, you know, if the Section 106 obligation for affordable housing is removed and there's a payment in its place, then, you know, we do need to think about the mix of tenures and how these big schemes get built out if you're not going to have, you know, the cash up front for a developer for shared ownership, where with first homes you have to sell them as each home gets sold. So, you know, there's lots of those sorts of issues around bigger sites. Smaller sites are easy, aren't they? You know, smaller sites are easy, but bigger sites, we need to really think about all those complexities around the different kinds of affordable housing, the mortgageability of first homes versus shared ownership, all these things that really, you know, are stable at the moment, where there are going to be changes to keep enabling those larger sites to be built out. I think, you know, those are things that really need to be ironed out as well.
Well, you know, we're getting close to our time, and these webinars are an hour. You can fill them when you get to London for maybe 2 hours or 3 hours, but there's some great things here. And one of the things I'm really struck by is the mayor's policies are there. They're fit for purpose, but they're now got a new demand on them in skills and foundation. Subsidy, government really needs to start looking very hard at the subsidy if it wants to keep the house building going in London. Infrastructure, that burden that London is putting, the house builders need to be there, but there's an element of who is providing all of that infrastructure, and the cost of schools, I think, was a really good example. Steve, you've got some massive challenges ahead in the short term. I suppose I'm going to be naughty and sort of miss Joanna out just at the moment, but just to sort of finish it, Steve, you're on the ground, you're the closest to the people of London. Do you believe that, what would you say is the key thing for us all to focus on, and what support should we give Jules and his team at City Hall to protect your residents?
I think I'm giving Jules support all of the time, and the Mayor, of course. But I think it's about understanding the effects for me in Hounslow and West London, the effects of the decline in the aviation industry long term, and what other industries we can encourage to come in and fill that gap. So really to understand what does the green economy mean, and what does it mean for local jobs and local people. So for me, that's the biggest challenge at the moment, and just making sure we deliver these new homes, and we're committed to do that. Before you cut me off, can I just do a very quick plug? We've got the first new flower market happening in Chiswick High Road this Sunday for 150 years. It's featured in Time Out. So if you're not doing it on Sunday morning between 9:30 and 3 o'clock, come to Chiswick. It is in Hounslow. I know Steve Cowan would love it to be in Hammersmith and Fulham, but it's not. So please come to Chiswick this Sunday for the first new flower market in London for 150 years. That's why the council's supporting the High Street.
Look, I want to thank you for that. Great plug, and nice idea. I'll think about that. The stories, the questions, the issues will go on, and I really have tremendous respect for those people who are trying to grapple with them, in Jules, Geeta and Steve. For Joanna, Oliver and ourselves, we're there to try and find ways that will help, work with our clients, and come up with hopefully some solutions. But it's a really clear view today. Thank you, Jules, for joining us. I'd like to thank all the team behind me, Candy, Sean, Louise and Julian, my understudy, who wasn't needed because my connection didn't go down. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been online listening to us. Really great crowd, some really good questions, which I hope that we've incorporated as many as we could go through as possible. But London will be an ongoing story, and we'll come back. But one of the issues is it's about the margins. That's what I'm going to remember. It's not about the big numbers. It's about the final margins and how we've got to deal with those. So thank you so much for saying how you feel and letting us go forward. Thank you and good morning.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.